Nós vamos dar início às apresentações de hoje com a palestra Ecology of Diseases from a Density Dependent Population Approach, ministrada pelo Dr. Sérvio Pontes Ribeiro. O Dr. Sérvio é graduado em Ciências Biológicas pela Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais e também mestre pela UFMG e doutor em Ecologia pela University of London. Atualmente, ele atua como professor titular na UFOP. Bom dia, professor Sérvio Pontes, muito obrigada pela sua presença aqui e aceitar o convite da comissão organizadora, e eu te passo a palavra.
Ok, muito obrigado a vocês. Vamos então dar o início de uma vez, já passando então para... Espero que todos possam acompanhar. So, good morning. This is my talk. I'm as was said, I'm professor in the Universidade Federal of Ouro Preto. I'm putting my career coming from a peer-based ecology towards ecology of diseases, and I decided today to explore a little bit with you what are these interface between ecology and health, and how these communicate, and how this evolves with time within science, and how can understand these ecology of diseases and why I'm taking this into a density-dependent population approach. So to understand this and how this is important, we have to make a question which are based on the way we are looking at diseases these days. Like, this is the one eco-health approach. When you're looking at people within an ecosystem or within an environment, and if this environment is diseased in a sense that you have disturbance enough to have not a healthy condition for people, you're going to get diseased as well. So in many aspects, what we are asking is, what are our ecosystem diseased? And how can you understand an ecosystem got to a level that that's not the natural condition related to that? So what ecologists look at ecosystems and ecological communities, which are a set of organisms of different species interacting between them as natural, are when these organisms within these ecosystems are functioning in a way that their interactions result in a certain flow of matter and energy, and that can provide us some services, what you call ecosystem services, because that is working as it evolved to work. So this is actually a talk about evolution of process and interactions. And now we're going to see how we can get disturbance into the habitats within which the ecosystems evolved at a level that the functionality of that ecosystems will be affected enough. So you can look at them from a healthy perspective and say, this is a diseased ecosystem. This is a diseased ecosystem. So what's involved here is what is unnatural in the process. Of course, in a process of parasitism or an infectious disease, we're going to have individuals get diseased. This is the process. If individuals were not getting disease, and by that I mean losing the capability of reproduction or survivalship for a longer time than what happened when they have the disease, if this was not happening, this was not supposed to be a natural selection force, and it is a very important natural selection force that shapes the world as we understand. And that's what I want to show you, how important disease are when affecting a certain number of organisms within a population. This means we need to have a certain proportion of individuals being infected and getting disease, which is much smaller than the amount of individuals carrying these parasitic species within their bodies. The balance between having the parasitic interaction and having some individuals diseased are the difference between having a healthy and working functional ecosystem or not. So the approach is for ecosystem by looking at species and population focus hypothesis. To get to that, first let's have a look in what is not a diseased parasitic interaction, or in other words, what are the most beautiful and also horrible parasitic interactions we can see, and what is the evolutionary importance of those. So let's start with Leucochloridium paradoxum. This is very nice plateau mint that goes into the eyes of these slugs, as this, and by getting to the eyes of these slugs, this is affecting first the capability of these slugs to understand what's dark and light, and then the behavior shift, and instead to look for and put the bodies inside places which are dark and then protect, they go to the light. They go to the light because they cannot distinguish that, and they're looking for something, and a little bit of and quite strong light will be a little bit dark for them. And then the parasite's going to be flashing like this in the sunny areas, exposed areas. What's going to happen is this slug is going to be eaten by the main host, which is a bird. And the feces of these birds, when eaten by the slugs, close the cycle. It's a quite beautiful evolutionary response of an organism which are parasitic, and showing the importance and sophistication of the evolution of these interactions. But that's nothing compared with this one. This is what is known in Brazil as berne. This is a mosca do berne. This fly is horrible fly, is a giant animal. It's 10 times bigger than the musca domestica. And the larva of these flies actually comes inside your skin through the capillarity of the hairs, and they developed in your tegumentary tissues, eating your flesh. I got 7 of that in my life, and I never could understand how could I manage to leave such a horrible giant fly to lay eggs on my skin, stay there laid for enough time to put an egg on my body. But actually, this fly never touched my skin. What touched my skin was a mosquito, an hematophagous mosquito. This is a fantastic and amazing evolution of behavior where this fly captures a mosquito in the air. It's very difficult to find this picture. This is a very recent work in 2017. And this is Anopheles is carrying the eggs already with the larva ready to jump. So when this hematophagous insect blow their abdomen with blood and expanded, the eggs is going to release from the intersegmentary membrane and drop in the skin, and the larvae go straight inside your body. This is just how things evolve. This is how sophisticated the evolution of life as a parasite can be. And let's have a look at how important this is for ecosystems. It's not just like a curious interaction between two species, but it's something else. A final example is this Myrmeconema neotropicum affecting this Cephalotes pusillus individual within the colony. This guy has its reddish abdomen and is moving strangely and calling attention of birds. They're going to capture it and go up and then close this cycle of this little parasite too. When looking at ants, we can understand a little better how important these parasitic organisms are, because these are individuals that occur in high densities in the environment. They change how the ecosystem is. They are what we can call engineering species, because they affect the ecosystem, they affect the flow of matter and energy, mainly in the tropics. And ant colonies are shaped by the parasitic organisms that affect them. From Ophiocordyceps to phorid flies, they're always attacking the workers outside the colonies. And the colonies evolved this very sophisticated system where you have social immunity by cleaning, by identifying individuals contaminated, expelling them, and then producing antimicrobial components from several glands in the body. So what shapes the ecology and the functionality of tropical forests, for instance, of all ecosystems, all forests, or any biomes, are the insects. The insects are very important for them, and then the insects are shaped by the parasitic interactions they have in their natural environments. That's how they evolved. That's very important. Why? Because those parasitic organisms are actually regulating the size of the population of their hosts. And to regulate the size of population of one species is very much important for the other ones. We're going to get to that in a few seconds. But before, let's see at us in this system. When you look at the diseases getting to human and human in a civilized, large global system, we start to wonder if what we are having a natural or result of the disturbance we have caused in the planet. So we have a little bit of both. We have a proper, typical, natural, very little disease like the brain-eater amoeba that can kill and must kill the host because it needs this host to be dead on the side of the water where this amoeba is close its life cycle. So this needs to be very little. And then you go for a gradient that when more contagious you are, the least lethal you must be. So measles, for instance, if you look deeply in the eyes in someone with measles, you're probably going to get diseased as well if you're not vaccinated. But this is hardly going to kill you. Then you have an Ebola who's going to kill you a lot, but hardly is going to be contagious beyond those people in direct contact with the bloody, with the liquids coming out of the body of someone infected, and SARS-CoV-2, which stopped our society and make us rethink disease and how we deal and why we have the disease as we have. To have a look on that, we are forced to understand and to think on eco and One Health approach, which is an interdisciplinary approach to things in disease. But before that, let's have a look in what is ecology of disease in this context. As I said, this is interdisciplinary, and not as many ecology as health, typical medicine, and public health approach are into the things developed in Ecohealth. We have to balance that. I'm going to show you how we could do that, coming back to what is the classical ecology of disease and how old this actually is. This is a long road from ecology and evolution of host pathogens to an Ecohealth approach. As long as beginning of this 20th century, when you have Haldane, is the guy belonging to the group of scientists that recovered Mendel and Darwin approach to what could be evolution and created the modern synthesis. And Haldane was already talking about resistance and genotypes affected and being selected by diseases as an important driver for evolution of the species, and was the main inspiration for William Hamilton, who actually was working on the evolution of sex as something absolutely necessary to have been evolved because we have disease. But between Hamilton in the 80s, 90s, when they did their life into that, and Haldane in the beginning of the century, we have, this I think is cutting on the top, this is a Nature paper on 1979 from Anderson May and Anderson. These two very important articles are kind of seminal approach to diseases. This is a population biology of infectious diseases, are not actually dealing with humans. These are classical words on how host, parasite evolve in nature. They study different species and the process of infection on those populations. And if you have a look on this here, these are the classical equations that produce what you have been using for SARS-CoV-2 now, which is susceptible, infected, and recovered in the past called immune individuals in a model that can help you to understand how the disease, how the infection is going to evolve within the population of this organism. But before to get there, let's understand the paradigm on the back of the mind of an ecologist looking into disease. This is Verhulst's classical growth population model. When you have a starting point, let's say a virus invading a new host species, and that's going to grow in an exponential way, stronger if you have more fecundity, or is lower if you have less fecundity, and it's going to be stopping the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is a constant, predictable, and renewable value of the amount of individuals the system can get. How many of that individuals parasitized and infected you can get in your population without having a collapse of this population. But then when you look at most of the species, let's say, not those, you can have this can be very real model if you have organisms eating seeds or fruits or drinking blood of their hosts, instead killing the origin of the resources. They can work on these resources, but most of the times what we have is actually a system like this one here in the bottom, when you have this mite, the six-spotted mite, and the predator of this mite, and this predator of this mite is the gray line responding to the growth of the mite population. When the mite population is growing, the predator is growing as well, and then overpass the mite, the prey, then this causes a depression in the population, a decline in the population of the prey, causing a decline of the population of the predator. So what we're seeing here is that the mite is going to never reach the carrying capacity for it. It may have a carrying capacity, a real likely carrying capacity, but the predation is going to prevent these species to get to that level. And then, for the point of view of the predators, what you're going to see is that the resource it's using is not a constant. It's not renewable in a constant way. The fact that you're using, and by using I mean killing the individuals you are eating, then you causing a fluctuation in this carrying capacity. And the fluctuation is resulting in your own fluctuation. So what you have here is a natural enemies regulated dynamics. So this is the very important point for this talk. When you have a parasite, the parasite is the predators. So what you're going to see is how you regulate the host population and how important this is for the functionality of ecosystems, a proper health ecosystem. So this go on in the May and Anderson paper. This is just to show you, this is the equations for susceptible, infected, and recovered individuals. And in that, it's important to see the daily rate of input of susceptible. This was an experiment with mice. So this means 6 and 3 for these graphs here, and this is A here, showing you different possibilities of input of new individuals. This input of new individuals are births of not infected individuals or migration or both. So this is not a dynamic, it's a comparison between different scenarios. In these different scenarios, the dashed line is with no parasites. So this is the equilibrium, let's say the population in what should be the carrying capacity, the amount of individuals that you could have, considering a different level of fecundity, the amount of new individuals getting to the population. And that's what you can get here, let's say 150, without the infectious disease. And that's what you actually get when you have the infectious disease. Can you see that now? When you translate that in days to reach a nice stabilization, that stabilization is going to be something much lower than the carrying capacity because it's modulated by the amount of disease you have in the system. That's going to be for 6 new susceptible individuals getting every day, much higher than when you have only 0.33 individuals getting there every day. But then when you look in the disease-induced mortality rate, then you have something different. This is also comparing scenarios, but what you see here is when you are starting from a large population and pay attention that this here in C is a starting population, is an equation, is a theoretical starting of the host population with a small amount of individuals. This here is a population already established that got diseased. And what you see is with an intermediate alpha, which is the disease-induced mortality rate, you're going to have a decline very severe of that population if you have a high A. If you have a lots of new susceptible individuals get into the population by reproduction, let's say, you're going to have fuel, you're going to have resources for the disease species, for the infectious species to spread, causing a severe decline in the population. Although the mortality is not proportionally too high. Remember the graph I showed you before? Highly little is not causing actually a problem in the population size. If you're not highly little, you're going to contaminate a lot. In the end of the day, you're going to cause a lot of death. Can you see the ecological reason why we find an isolated individual infected with SARS-CoV-2 or any other pandemic disease? It's to prevent this situation. Okay. Then they go for evolution of that still in the 80s. Remember, we're following the history of this. This is the 80s, and May and Anderson again have this fantastic paper, and this is a chaotic dynamic of fluctuation of gene frequency because of those genotypes which are resistant or which are susceptible for disease because of 1 or 2 genes. This is the model, and how this can vary because of the outbreaks of disease, causing a chaotic scenario, a chaotic model. And then we come back to Hamilton in the 90s when they associated that the problems caused by parasites and the genetic variability that can compensate the problems caused by parasites, and how that is more effective when you have a higher proportion of your population having sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is much more costly for a species than asexual reproduction. However, is the most effective way to cause genetic variability. And genetic variability is the way you have to prevent a very aggressive effect of parasites or diseases on your species. So that's how it evolves. So to get this to the end now, what you have is, I put this graph here back on purpose because the carrying capacity in this model, I'm going to show you who did this in a second, is here. If you have nothing like alpha, again the alpha is the mortality effect of the disease increasing from here to here, and its effects on fecundity here in FT. Those individuals you don't kill, you can decrease the capacity to reproduce. So that affects the average fecundity of that population. If it affects the average fecundity of that population, it's going to be affecting the exponentiality of this curve. By affecting the exponentiality of this curve and also changing the mortality rate, you're never going to get there because it's going to be regulated by that disease. So this is, again, very important. If I have a population of an important species in an ecological community declined or kept lower than the carrying capacity, what I have here? I have an excess of resources for another species that use the same kind of resources that this one here coexisting with that. By having diseases, by having predators, by having natural enemies, I'm going to have lower population of a species, an excess of resources than the coexistence of different species. By this, I mean higher biodiversity. The biodiversity of the ecosystems we know are designed by these antagonic interactions. Antagonic interactions allows and construct these communities with many species, and the more species, more stable your community are. So by having a host-parasite interaction in nature means having these interactions regulating all the species in a way that you are in a stable and functioning ecosystem. That's the approach. That's the approach until 95. This is a special issue in Trends in Ecology and Evolution, and there are several articles, all population-based studies that needs to be kept there. But look at this one, emerging infection disease. They were already looking at emerging infection disease in 95. Do you remember what we have there? We have no pandemic of respiratory disease by this time. We have HIV. HIV was in the people's mind, and you knew that was a spillover from nature. And that's 2012. This is much earlier than now, the pandemic, but you knew it. We were predicting the pandemic we live in now for quite a while. We just were not listened by the politics. And this is the approach we have now. The approach is more complex, it's more into community ecology. When you are not looking at the population and interactions, designing the ecology of this focused population, but you look in all the interaction between all the species in a community and what is the output of that. It's much more mathematical and has much less biology on that. But it still is very important to understand some phenomena, like, for instance, the variation of number of cases of wild animals diseased and having us and now domestic animals seen as part of the ecosystem, seen as inserted inside a natural ecosystem, and not anymore looking at us as a special kind of caged bird made in cities and transformed the rural areas. The more we change the ecosystem, they still are our ecosystems. And the more we affected that can change the chances and increase the chances to have a spillover of a disease from the wildlife towards us. This approach gets us to this type of paper like Dundon is a fantastic disease ecologist. And this paper is very interesting because he's looking the pathogen richness. This is in human beings. So it's the amount of pathogen richness you have affecting people in different countries and how that correlates with bird and mammal richness. So countries like Brazil is a hotspot of diversity of everything. We are on the top in the number of species. We're the country with more mammals and birds, wild mammals and birds in the planet. And by that, results that we have a high quantity of disease of pathogens affecting our species as well. So these are the countries with small pathogens, species affecting humans, and the gradient you have over the planet, and a quite straight correlation. That gives you the false impression that the more you have contact with birds and mammals, greater are chances for you to get diseased, but actually it's not that what happens. This is a strange perception, and that's affecting the way we deal with nature. The fear we have of natural ecosystem is because natural ecosystems have threats, and among those threats, disease are there. People are afraid of natural forests and wet places, mainly in the tropics, because of the diseases we can get there. Indeed, you can get there if you are not working a proper way in policies to control the effect of these diseases. So down here, you have the pathogen prevalence in human population. And you see that somehow correlated with the pathogen richness, but if you see in the map, it's not the same you had that. Why? Because many countries have the action, the public health action to control these diseases. So all these countries spreading towards the right side of the graphs are countries that have less pathogen prevalence than predicted by pathogen richness, because we're working on that. This is a civilized world. This is difficult to understand if you are looking to that into a perspective that shows human civilization as a whole. But you can look at humans as a wild animal living in nature in contact with the resources that shapes our populations. Yes, you can look in the hunter-gatherer populations around the world. And this paper of Talavera is a fantastic one for that. Just pay attention in A first. This is population density. This again is not a dynamics, are different human populations along this, which is a gradient of net primary productivity. That was measured by the amount of rainfall combined with the amount of light getting there for photosynthesis. So you have an increase of human densities, the amount of people per area in this population of hunters and gatherers in very poor ecosystem like a desert into intermediately productive ecosystems, let's say a subtropical woodlands or savanna. So the human population grows straight in response to net productivity. After that level of productivity, which is a subtropical or slightly temperate ecosystem with a slightly productive soil, you get a stable population. And it comes from this, for instance, to a very wet, hot tropical rainforest, indigenous community is going to have a population size, a population density not different to that. This has the cause of that is based on our ability to deal with the excess of biodiversity, because biodiversity is going to be a straight line from here to here. The more productivity the system great is going to be the biodiversity. But the thing is, we cannot use all that biodiversity. If you have like 7 to 12 species of animals and plants to eat, that's very stable. That's what you have here. It's food safety, because by having these different species to eat, we actually are managing when one of these species decline, we have some other one to feed on that. So this is diversity we can manage, we can handle for our survivorship. The diversity which is caused by an excess of productivity is important for other things which are not instinctive for us. Like, for instance, it's important for the stability of the climate, for the stability of the soil, for the productivity as a whole, for the production of biochemical molecules that we can use as a medicine. But that distinctives, not part of our survivorship genes. The survivorship genes we have, say, a single system is enough for us. That's maybe why instinctively we don't see too much of a problem in deforestation and affecting natural ecosystems in the tropics, because beyond that, something else. And that's in blue are the circles designing the pathogen stress on us. The pathogen stress increases with productivity, regardless of population down. So this graph below is the mirror of that one. This is the population size, and this is the effect of pathogen stress on those populations. So we have problem to understand how a very biodiverse and productive system like a tropical wet forest can be good for us, because human populations inside that have to deal with more pathogens and disease. If you look in the population density, the effect of productivity in biodiversity, you see human population density will respond positively to productivity in biodiversity, but the effect of pathogens can mess up this a little bit more. So ecology gets to disease ecology by trying to understand the effect of all these things together and how that shapes the natural communities and how that's changed by our presence. Our last two slides on the natural worlds, we're trying to understand. Johnson is another very important author, trying to see community ecology now directly affecting infectious disease. So this is the approach that Aristotle showed yesterday. When you're looking on microbiota, you're looking on community ecology of microorganisms within a host. So this is looking at the same, but considering those which are pathogens and not what we call indigenous species, which is very good for you, is part of the symbiotic or mutualistic species coexisting with you. And those mutualistic species coexisting with you will affect how many of those which are pathogens that are going to be parasiting your body that can coexist. So co-infection will depend on the type of microorganisms you have in mutualistic relation with you and the entrance of the different pathogens you have. That will shape, based on competition laws from ecology, of how many you can be co-infected and how many you can share between different hosts. And in this case, that will depend on the amount, the density of that hosts and the amount of times they meet together. This is important for us to understand the spillover from nature, which is caused mainly by bats and rodents, the pink and the orange ones. And why? Because these are species that are densely compacted in nature. They occur in highly dense populations where this is a graph for ectoparasites that can coexist, and the coexistence of those can actually affect the way you share the diseases or share the parasites you can have. Having understood that, let's then now look at what is a disease ecosystem and disease host pathogen interactions because of disease ecosystem. Can we see that? Actually, we can. When you look in the Doce River, this is the study system we have. It's the study system we have is an amazing basin of a river that goes towards this fantastic tropical rainforest with the several lakes, but it's also a place with some problems. We have for human population a lot of tropical diseases. We have heavy metals on the upper basin when you have the springs of the river Doce close to Ouro Preto, an effect of climate change in this altitudinal gradient, and the Samarco disaster. What is the Samarco disaster? It is a dam breach in a mining close to Ouro Preto, Mariana, in the upper basin, that goes down in the river and spread a toxic heavy metal rich mud that covered the river into the ocean. That changed completely the basin to worse, and that's unlikely to be recovered completely, and caused this contamination, which was a natural amount of heavy metals in a mining area, to spread down to lowlands, tropical lowlands. So if you're going to be talking about a disturbed ecosystem by heavy metals, that's thinking how organisms can deal with heavy metals in nature. Heavy metals, they bind with organic matter in a definitive way, so they contaminate you for good. And that can cause you problems. They can decline your fecundity So it's not a disease, but it's going to choose disease, but it's going to get you disease by a contamination. That's the problem we cause to ourselves when we increase the amount of heavy metals in the environments where they were not there. By heavy metals, we mean all metals we actually also need. And metallothionein is this tiny little protein that evolved to balance or to make the homeostasis of those metals which are fundamental for our survivalship, like zinc, iron, and some other of that. But then this protein can also be induced by the amount of heavy metals in nature, and this induction from the nature presence of these heavy metals can produce a response to decontaminate our bodies to the presence of those. This is very important for all organisms, from fungi to us, but it's very important and highly diverse in how these proteins are among insects, and specifically looking at those which are the hematophagous insect. So think, if you have a originally phytophagous group of insects that resulted in this, longipalpis, the vector of the Leishmanian infantum, the visceral leishmaniasis. This is a species that evolved from plant sugar to a heavily contaminated diet, which is blood, very rich in iron, and has to deal with this contamination to survive. So then, if you can deal with a diet which is rich in iron, could you not be able to deal with the iron and other metals close to that in nature, in places which are naturally rich of those metals? So these places with heavy metals should be hotspots, unbearable places with so many hematophagous insects. But the fact is, at least for the tropics, what we have is most of these places with lots of natural heavy metals on the surface of the soil are mountainous ecosystems. So in the mountain, the climate are much colder than most of these insect vectors can cope with, or at least it was much warm, much colder than it is now. So this expansion of leishmaniasis, visceral leishmaniasis in Minas Gerais state, before and after 2006, and you can see this expansion is substantial, and they happen in mountain areas. So all these mountain areas are getting more of Leishmanian infantum because they're getting more of Lutzomia longipalpis, and also the Doce River basin, which is here, had this increased as well. If the hypothesis then we have is that the species that can cope with a contaminated environment, like Lutzomia longipalpis, a generalistic, opportunistic species capable to deal with contamination, is living in the lowlands of the Doce River. Is Doce River now a highway to hell for the communities, the human communities and cities in the mountain areas where we did not have leishmaniasis yet, like Ouro Preto City, above 1,600 meters above sea level? So is the disturbance in ecosystem or question equals to disease interactions when and how? If you look at this, we can summarize like that sentence: a habitat without predators, competitors, or any other component capable to regulate a vector species population, being this a species adapted to disturbed and contaminated environments, then we may get to a diseased interaction. By diseased interaction, then I mean when one species can live with this situation, as soon as organic matters accumulated on this mud. This is within the Governador Valadares city, and this is the Doce River. If you have like the immature phases of Lutzomia longipalpis coping with this level of contamination, it's going to be in an environment like this without natural enemies. And by existing without natural enemies, the population of this vector of a disease will increase too much, will cause lots of outbreaks for humans and dogs in the cities, in places that we got very contaminated. So yes, eventually Doce River became a highway to hell, and the hell is from lowlands, tropical places with tropical diseases, towards the mountain, which is the most sensitive, vulnerable ecosystems for global warming. The tropical mountains are the most vulnerable ones. And you already have seen that before. This is the graphic increase of temperature from 60s until now. This is summer and winter temperature. We see in the 80s when it got like high winter temperatures, we got the invasion of Aedes aegypti in Brazil again, in southeastern Brazil. And now into 21st century, we finally got Aedes aegypti invading Ouro Preto region, where it was not before. A few years after, we got dengue invading Ouro Preto city, being now a tropical disease in a city which originally was a city with subtropical temperature, so not anymore. If you look in the distribution of dengue and Aedes aegypti in the world, we see that along the same decades, we have an increase in population in the events of both in places where they invaded, like the Americas and Asia, but not in Africa, where this insect and this virus evolved actually. So we change in the world, and the way we change the world are favoring the Aedes aegypti more than only temperature. We can see that also in Ouro Preto Mariana. When you look at that's both Aegypti and Albopictus, these both invasive Aedes species. We see that they are more common. They have higher populations, far areas. So this is the green areas, and the be found here little of natural vegetation. When you look on that in a large capital cities like Belo Horizonte, we see the dengue cases changing the same way. And it's very interesting thing in this combination of pictures that here is a place with a high health susceptibility index. This likewise here. So we have two places which are human population are exposed to several diseases for many reasons related to poverty, but those here closer to a natural vegetation, a native forest, are getting less dengue. This is a paper I'm developing from with the Federal University of Minas Gerais, the School of Medicine, and the Saúde Urbana project. And that's showing us something very important we didn't think before. Dengue is a disease caused by us, not by the Aedes aegypti. And what we cause for Aedes aegypti is the same we caused for sparrows. We disturbed, we impacted, we contaminated, we degraded our cities at a level that native birds cannot cope with it. When you have sparrows, fauna just could not stand and cope with the pollution we produced. The same for Aedes aegypti. They can live in that very degraded city, but not the natural enemies of the Aedes aegypti that prevents and have prevented quite well these species to get into natural vegetation. We cannot find Aedes aegypti in tropical forests in Brazil at all. That's because they have enemies there. For the conclusion and new directions for science, if you're going to talk about ecology and health, ecology and health are the same. There is a gap in the communication between scientists that prevented ecologists to talk to health public people and vice versa. Then we're talking about biodiversity and pathogens respond to the same things. And that gap in communication is bizarre because as I showed you, as you have seen, the ecologists are studying host pathogen diseases and infectious diseases for quite a long time. So it's part of our understanding of nature. It's part of the way ecologists look at nature. The diseases and the infectious diseases and parasitic organisms and how they affect and regulate the hosts for quite a long time. We are just like looking into our nice natural systems and not talking with people in health. A few start in the 90s, but you have to make this stronger and more important. It's urgent our need to break down disciplinary barriers between us. And that's what you're trying to do. I like this example. This is my very good friend, Magno Borges from the State University of Montes Claros. He's a classic parasitologist, a fantastic parasitologist, master's and PhD in pure classic parasitology. And that's me, an ecologist, also classic, did master's in ecology, in theoretical ecology, master's and PhD in theoretical ecology. And we both he start to look by the need of having more ecology in his study and looking more in the interactions, in the things he understands very well, which are the parasitological interactions. And in my case, I start to realize that ecology is a mathematical biology. But in many cases, we're missing the biology on the back of that. We have to understand better how the interactions are. We have to understand what is the importance of the pH of the in the gut of the Lutzomia longipalpus and how that affects the microbiota and how that affects the Leishmania infantum and the chances to get a person contaminated by that mosquito. That's pure biology that we need to have into ecology to go ahead. So ecology of diseases is a combination of understanding more of parasitology and more of ecology at the same time, more of the quantitative effects on the population scale and what is the biological drivers, what are the biological mechanisms behind the output in numbers, the percentage of infected organisms, the amount of infection you got, how many recovered individuals you have. So we're going towards the same roads, starting different points. Magno is unbearable. He's too fast. He's learning much faster than me. We're going different speeds, but we're going to the same places, ecology of diseases, from parasitology and ecology. And when we get there, Magno first time after him, we're going to go together with everybody else doing the same, from the biological worlds towards ecohealth, if we work together with all these guys. And fortunately, we are working with these people from immunology, from epidemiology, from microbiology, from public health, and from physics, because we need to model all these things. Then you're going to get a proper eco-health, a proper understanding of how ecosystems, people, animals, and food supply can be protected from being a diseased system by being prepared for everything you have to come. So these old people try to do this, and old people are not so able to do that as well as young people. So these four working needs to have what we luckily and fortunately managed to have already, a group of fantastic students as passionate for that as myself. So this is it. We need to instruct people, we have to train people, we need to have a new generation involved in seeing the world as one thing, for people and for nature, for biodiversity and for survivorship of our species inside this system. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and sorry for going a little bit more than what was expected. Thank you.
Professor Sérgio, eu agradeço pela sua palestra, pela sua excelente palestra. Nós recebemos aqui muitas parabenizações em relação à sua palestra e também algumas perguntas bem interessantes. Eu vou começar com a primeira pergunta. Parabéns pela palestra. Gostaria de saber como os desmatamentos que vêm acontecendo afetam a ecologia das doenças infecciosas aqui no Brasil.
Bom, responda, as respostas estão sendo em português, certo, Angélica?
Sim, tá tem bem. Algumas em português, tem uma em inglês só.
Tá bem. Seria melhor traduzir a pergunta e...
Pode ser, o senhor quer responder em inglês? Eu posso traduzir.
Tá bem.
Tá?
Excluir as pessoas.
I would like to know how burning areas that has been happening affect ecology of infectious disease here in Brazil.
Okay, to answer that, thank you for your question. I'm gonna present you a data that Fiocruz has. Fiocruz has a virus bank for the Amazon that shows more than 100 species of virus potentially capable to invade us. Then when you're destroying a tropical rainforest, we cannot actually get the disease that evolved in the forest destroyed as well. Disease do not work like that. When you destroy the forest, you're going to have animals stressed, running away from that destruction, from burning or from deforestation. And that species running in highly stressed situation is going to be an animal with a very high viral load of anything it gets. And that's how spillovers happen. When you have an animal under stress, captured by people and eaten, then we're going to have this animal with a high being in contact with human body and increasing the probability of having a new emergent disease by spilling over. So a highly intense degradation, deforestation, and burning of the Brazilian ecosystems now put us as a villain in the planet because of climate change, and put us as a villain in the planet because we may be the source of the next pandemic. And it's not necessarily going to wait this one to finish. It can happen at any time. As I showed you in 2012, we already were expecting this to happen because of the increasing of deforestation, of impacts of humans in natural ecosystems, mainly in the tropics. So that's the main problem we have now.
And second question, congratulations for your presentation. I would like to know, how is the relationship between viral diseases, the ones you show in the presentation, for example, like SARS-CoV, Ebola, with the insect population?
For those which are transmitted by insects, like the arboviruses and other disease, they can, in most of the cases, then affect the insects as well. So the insect who is transmitting the disease is also infected. So it's not part of its natural mutualistic microbiota, these organisms. They are infectious species. They evolved to contaminate you, and they contaminate the insects as well. So when you have an insect under stress, a population under contaminated, polluted, degraded area, you may have those insects also more susceptible for these diseases, then more capable to transmit to us. We've seen this with Aedes aegypti. It can be more susceptible to dengue in some places than in other places. And likewise, when you have in Brazil albopictus being less related with densely occupied places, eventually you have it being somehow more susceptible to the disease. So it affects likewise.
Okay. And is there any study of how the break of the São Francisco River Dam interfered in the pathogens insect population?
The Doce River, you meant, probably, yeah.
Yes, it says São Francisco River, but
actually it's
yes,
Doce River, I guess.
Doce River.
Yes, there are some studies imposed by the public minister and by the Renova Foundation, which was created by Vale Company to deal with the impact. They are obliged to produce some data on that. So there are some monitoring on those populations made by very competent people, but these are data that are produced for the legal system. We are starting to monitor those insects in the Doce River ourselves without funding from them. So I have a PhD student already and going to have another 2 working on the Doce River, monitoring the vector species and all hematophagous species with no funding from the Vale company. So we're going to have, there are actually different data. There are data from the public minister, which was funded differently to compare with those paid by the Fundação Renova directly. And then we in academia, we are producing our own data. So, but all that is in the beginning. But they have data for much longer time than we. We began this year.
Okay. One more question. Professor, excellent lecture.
Thank you.
Areas with metal, such as the ones that appears with breaking of dams, will have more adapted animals to this ambient full of metals, Is it because of the metallothionein protein you presented?
Well, actually, when you go to the upper mountains, there are the ecosystem where species evolved to deal with heavy metals. And what you have seen before, I'm coming from insect-plant interactions. I was looking, my first host-parasite systems are the herbivores on the plants. And you look on the plants around Ouro Preto city, what you see is the plants, they do better with heavy metals. They accumulate the heavy metals in the tissues, and that accumulation on the tissues actually cause some protection for those plants, because those with more have less herbivory. They are less damaged by the herbivorous insects. And when you compare the herbivorous insect populations in the upper part of the mountain with lowlands and tropical lands, you have much less in Ouro Preto area. There is a combination of confounding things here, of course. We have a colder weather still, but we have a difficulty. It's much more difficult for insects to overcome the effect of heavy metals. That's largely seen in the literature. The thing we start to study, this is ongoing, this is Camila's PhD project, is how you can be an opportunistic, a very generalistic species capable to deal with contamination and then able to invade these areas. And then these heavy metals on the surface is in the mountains. There you have these species evolved to that. When you go down to the Valadares, Timóteo, Ipatinga, there are places where the fauna, flora, the biodiversity on those places did not evolve to have heavy metals on them. So that actually is a change in the system, and those capable to do with this, you have no natural enemies. And metallothionein is a protein that is involved in these mechanisms. We're just starting to study in this perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you for the talk. Do you believe the local environmental disturbances could increase some disease and distribution area, such as neglected tropical diseases?
Yes, absolutely. And might be increasing. If you look at Lutzomia longipalpis, the vector of the visceral leishmaniasis, is a native species, is endemic of the Atlantic rainforest. But if you sample in a protected area like the state park of Rio Doce, you don't find it. This is a species, eventually, human presence even before European comes to Brazil, but they are adapted to places we modified. And one thing is we modified the places they are with us. This species is found in suburbs of the cities. And the poorer, the least well kept in terms of sanitary and basic service, the more you have these insects, the more you have cases of leishmaniasis. So the degradation of the environment is something that should not be seen as something we cause to nature. That's something we cause to us. When you have poverty, when you have people living on the side of the sewage going straight to the river, you have a degraded environment and people living inside the degraded environment. It's very much important to us to think on the environmental racism. When you have some populations getting more of the impact and less of the benefits of any industrial or urbanization process, and then you abandon those populations in the poverty, which means abandoning them to live in degraded environments. To degrade environment where communities live is to cause poverty more than lack of money. So absolutely yes. The impact we cause in the ecosystem is the impact we cause in our cities. That is an ecosystem we degraded largely, and we degraded more where poor people are living. So it's unfair distribution of the impacts we're causing. And yes, it's increasing neglected diseases everywhere in this planet.
Yes. Thank you so much for this answer. We have one last question, and it's about the rain, the deforesting of Pantanal, if it could bring back infectious disease or to level up its incidence.
Well, that's more likely to happen because of what we're doing to the Amazon. The Amazon is the home of several important diseases. The Pantanal is different. The Pantanal, the impact we cause now are on important endangered vertebrate species like mammals, birds, and animals. They are very special for our identity, our biodiversity identity, like the jaguar, may disappear because you're having 30% of the place where most of the population are destroyed completely. So that's important for that. And why the Pantanal is different? Because it's not working. This was my PhD thesis, actually. That place does not work as a tropical place. Why? Because it has a very severe and dramatic change in climate conditions. They have unpredictable rains, unpredictable floods, and unpredictable temperature variation because of the cold mass air coming from the Antarctic. Because they don't get disease as well. So what's happening in the Pantanal is too serious. It's very, very serious. It's a crime because it's a crime against the biodiversity. The very much symbolic, iconoclastic species that define what South America is important for our culture in many aspects. But that's not where the diseases are coming from. They will come from the Atlantic rainforest, will come from the Doce River Valley, and will come from the Amazon, most likely, I would say.
Okay, thank you. The last one is not a question, it's a commentary. Sergio, thank you so much for present an extremely important work, especially by this time we're living in. I'm also a biologist, and we know how much it is important, more than ever, to fight for nature. Thank you for showing people that knowledge and science is above any negationism.
Thank you very much for listening.
And I thank you for the very good lecture and for the discussion of the questions. It was a pleasure to have you here, Professor Sergio.
Pleasure was mine. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Bom, pessoal, agora a gente vai para um pequeno intervalo e a gente volta com mais apresentações.